At the subscription rooms in Stroud, an exhibition of paintings in aid of homeless children in El Salvador. The artist is 86-year-old Diana Lodge, surrounded by some of her many friends and admirers and by family, including a great-granddaughter. Diana Lodge's outer journey began in a Welsh village in the year 1906. She was married to a poet, son of the great physicist and spiritualist Oliver Lodge. At the age of 61, she became a Roman Catholic, but her inner journey and its struggles began many years earlier. Many of Diana's paintings are of her beloved Black Mountains in Wales, where she has a remote and primitive caravan. Her home, where she lives alone, is a cottage in the Slad Valley, a few miles from the Gloucestershire town of Stroud. Diana, this is you, is it?
Yes. That's by Duncan Grant. Yes.
You knew him, did you?
Oh, yes, yes. My husband was a great friend and took me along to him, and he painted a lot of pictures.
Is there any particular artist who's influenced you?
What do you mean, alive or dead?
Either.
Well, I remember my first enthusiasm was for Vincent van Gogh, and going to Birmingham, and there was a big exhibition long ago with my husband, so it's a long time ago, and being bowled over by this room full of these gorgeous great canvases.
Diana paints interiors, usually her own, and landscape. At first glance, there seems to be little evidence in her art of her inner journey. I asked her when she first became aware of this spiritual dimension in her life.
Oh. Well, perhaps it was in the 1940s, quite a long time ago, really, when things started to happen, like my son got diabetes, and he was only 2, you know, and when one was really up against suffering, in fact, I think that was the beginning when I felt that I just don't know how to cope, especially when they tell you that you've got a 50-50 chance that they'll bring the child's life through if he's rushed into hospital in a diabetic state, you know, going into a coma. That was the worst thing of all when they said that, when he was a few years old by then, about 4 or 5. And they said, well, we'll see, but they didn't promise. And we had to wait that night. I remember we stayed near the hospital. And then what can you do? A mother, you know, you throw yourself on your knees. There's nothing else when you got to that point. And just prayed. And that really was the turning point, I think. And it was awful. But the marvelous thing was, when we went to the hospital the next morning, they just said it's cured. So, tremendous relief, you know.
But before that, had you prayed?
Oh, yes, but not in a very consistent and serious way, really. I was brought up in the Church of England. And I remember in adolescence going through that sort of time and thinking, oh, I'd like to be a missionary or something like that, you know, at certain times when you think those things. But it was a bit vague. And I don't know, I was very high-spirited, and as I got older, I can identify myself with Thomas Merton, because, you know, I was given his life, and I speak about 1948, just not long after my son got diabetes. And it had a tremendous effect on me because I could identify with him. Thomas Merton, you know, the Trappist, as he became eventually.
Because he had quite a life, didn't he?
Yes. As he said, he grabbed at life with both his hands. And that made a tremendous impression on me, reading that book, the realization. And of course, I knew nothing about the Catholic Church. I'd never even met one. There wasn't one in our little Welsh village where I was brought up, and I had no Catholic friends. I think that was perhaps my first awareness of it. And the book was, it was an American edition I was given, Seven Storey Mountain, but in England it was called Elected Silence.
What had your life been like prior to that then? Had you grabbed at life with both hands too then?
Yes, later, yes, in a way, because I started off, you see, being brought up in a little Welsh village and going to the university and getting trained as a teacher and teaching for a while, and then the feeling that this wasn't what I wanted. And I went on the stage. I think my family were rather horrified, but they didn't actually stop me. I remember my grandfather saying, "How could you, leave such a good profession, and then when you are old, you will have a lovely pension, you will be retired." And this absolutely horrified me. And I wrote to my parents and said, "I'm giving up teaching and going on stage." And my father, very cautiously, he was a Welsh schoolmaster, wrote and said, "Don't burn your boats." And I wrote back and said, "I long to see my boats flaming high." I did get a job with the Tiller Girls for 2 weeks as a showgirl.
What did that involve?
Well, it only involved dressing up and being at the back of the stage and floating around. We were all tall. I was tall in those days. I've shrunk. But always at the back of my mind, I had this ambition to marry a poet and bring up a family in the country.
And you did marry your poet, didn't you then?
Yes. That was amazing, wasn't it? Yes.
And had a family?
Yes. And had a family and always lived in the country. Yes.
And when did you start painting?
Oh, not until I was married.
Yeah.
It was my husband who started me off. Not an art school or art at school or anything. He drew very well and loved art and knew a great deal about art. And he always encouraged me, you see. But of course, bringing up the children, there wasn't much time. We didn't have much money. We lived in a little cottage in the country.
Diana, can you describe your spiritual journey? You've spoken of your child's illness and of Thomas Merton.
Yes.
What happened next?
Well, I began searching. This is when I went into Subud, I think.
What is Subud?
Well, it's something that came from Indonesia. Bapak was the instigator. He was apparently an Indonesian who had some kind of vision that he had to help the world. And we gathered once a week and we stayed together in silence. And the idea was that the spirit would come through and people would then relax. And sometimes some people would sing or shout or cry or just lie down or do nothing.
That's something like the Quakers then, isn't it? Quaker meeting.
Yes, except that you could make a noise, you see, which you're not expected to just make a noise with the Quakers. I don't think, are you? You speak.
You have to behave yourself.
Yes. And I can remember that my instinct always was to lie down and be quiet. And eventually, I didn't know this for some time, I realized that what I wanted to do was to pray. But it wasn't a good atmosphere for praying with people making a noise, do you see? But after I'd been in it for some time now, I don't know how long, perhaps years, I can remember going to a meeting, and it was at the sub-rooms in Stroud, so it was when I was here, much later, you see. And by chance, I was locked out, and I knew that if I went round to the back door and knocked on the window, they'd let me in, but the front door was locked. And it came over me, you don't have to go, you know. You don't have to go. And by then I think I'd been in and out of the Catholic Church, just seeing it. You can go to church and pray. And I went to the Catholic Church here at Beeches Green in Stroud and prayed. And at that point I realized this is what I really wanted to do, was to pray and not, and I slowly left. Well, I left Seward then. But I can remember when I was still in Seward also, we went to France in the coach load to have a retreat in a convent, which they just rented the rooms, you see, in Paris. And it was a Seward retreat. And Bapak, who was the instigator, was there on the platform talking to us. And on the Sunday morning, they said, well, nothing's happening on the program this morning, so you're free. So I went out into the streets alone and I wandered about. And I came to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is just an ordinary sort of bourgeois area, church in Paris, in fact, you know. And it was time for Mass, and people were going in. And I thought, well, I might as well go in. Why not? So I went in, and I sat there with them. And it came over me that in this building there was the spirit. It was full of the spirit of prayer. And I'd see people coming in, just like Thomas Merton described in his book. A pretty young girl would come in and kneel down and pray. And she wasn't just making a token, as one does when you go into church, little prayer and then sit up. But she stayed praying. And it came over to me that people were really praying in this building. And this is where I belonged. And when I realized this was where I belonged, I just cried, which was relief. Nobody paid any attention, nobody knew me, you see. And that was a big point, really, because at that point I thought, well, somehow I've got to get into this church.
What sort of age were you then?
I wonder, because you see, my husband had died. I was 59 when he died, so I could be in my early 60s, about 60 or 61 perhaps, or a bit more, but not, yes, that was quite some time later.
And how soon did you actually become a Roman Catholic then? What happened?
Well, at that time, I was living with someone, you see. I wasn't married to them. This was some years after my husband had died. And I was living with him. In fact, I'd taken his name to make it simpler because he was a professor. And it seemed to me perfectly all right in those days when I did it. And then the more I read, because I read a great deal of Catholic books, Taya de Chardin, people lent me, but was very much read at that time. And the person I was living with was a professor in Puerto Rico. So I'd go there for the winter holidays, and then my son, who was at school in England, would join us for Christmas. You see, this is how we lived. And it took a long time, really, because I felt that I couldn't leave him, because I couldn't let him down somehow.
Why did you have to leave him? Was it a choice between Roman Catholicism and the man you were living with?
Yes, but I must say that it wasn't heroic like it was with dead Dorothy Day, who left the man she loved because she wanted to enter the church and went on loving him. And it was a really heroic thing. In my case, we were beginning to get on not too well and realizing that we were very different people and wanted a different kind of life. And he certainly disliked my allegiance to the Catholic Church naturally and didn't believe it really, you know. And I wanted to leave him, and yet I felt that perhaps I couldn't let him down somehow. And then one day, you see, one of the points was we couldn't get married. There was an obstacle, which was really financial, because we used the money that my husband had left me for the fares to go to Puerto Rico. And in the will, if I married, I lost the money. And so that had been one of the reasons why we hadn't married earlier on. And then I thought, well, if I really believed in God and that he'd look after me, don't worry about money, he'll look after me if this is what he wants. And so marry him and enter the church. And so then I said to him, okay, I'll marry you. And then he said, I couldn't take the responsibility of a wife. He's never been able to marry. And then I can remember I had to hide my face because I was so thrilled. I was free. I remember feeling, oh, let's buy a bottle of champagne to celebrate, but of course I couldn't because I didn't say anything to him like that. But the next day, the priest who I'd been friendly with and who knew I wanted to become a Catholic and knew I couldn't and knew the whole situation, he was an American in Puerto Rico. I remember going to him and saying, well, in fact, I couldn't speak for a bit. I was crying. I do. It sounds as if I cry all the time, but I do cry. I suppose it's the Welsh in me. I can become Catholic. I'm going to join the church. And he started instruction. And so we did split.
Have you had regrets since then?
Never a regret. Oh, no. The best thing I did was to join the church. I think I'm the sort of person who needed the structure. And although there were things I didn't like about the church, and there were sort of rules and regulations perhaps in some ways, and some attitudes that I didn't like, I swallowed the whole thing. What was it Chesterton who said, hook, line and sinker? When he became a Catholic, he swallowed a lot. And now I see some of the things that I didn't like are changing, you know. I mean, I've always been a pacifist. I was in the first Aldermaster March. And the church's attitude on the whole had irritated me, of course, but it's changing, so. I think respectability was one of the things that used to bother me and bothered my friends, because when they heard that I was becoming Catholic, so many of my friends were horrified. Said, how can you do a thing like this? Because lots of our friends were artists and poets, and none of them were Catholics. And I used to go to retreats, and they were very often very sort of tidy, respectable ladies that I didn't really fit in with. But you know, one changes as you get older.
Diana Lodge attends Mass at a church in Stroud, but she's also attached to nearby Prinish Abbey as what is called a Benedictine oblate.
You follow the same guidelines, but you're in the world, so you stayed in the world, so there are many aspects, of course, that you don't take over. But the Benedictine spirituality I like very much. It's work and prayer, you know, laborare et orare is the motto. And also the arts very much encouraged, and also manual labor, because St. Benedict says, then are you truly monks when you live by the labor of your own hands. So I like that idea. I think it must be awfully hard for people who have no faith. Gosh. Sometimes we have to be pushed on our knees.
I asked Diana if she felt she was able to express her faith in her art.
Yes, it's the love, I suppose. It's the same thing. It's all love, really, isn't it? I can remember painting in Puerto Rico a long time ago, some lovely white cathedral against a blue sky, and this sort of real wave of love that came over me for it. And I said out loud, "Oh, I love you," but I realized that I was speaking to God, in a way. So that if I do the thing I love, although it isn't a so-called spiritual picture, it's giving some of the love, which is really God showing himself through a daisy or anything like that.